My name is Lyra Wexley, and I learned early that some families worship recipes more than their own children. I married into the Wexley family 3 years ago, believing love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. I was wrong. The Wexleys weren't just passionate about food, they were obsessed with it in a way that bordered on religious fanaticism. At the center of this obsession sat my mother-in-law, Drusilla Wexley, a woman who treated her family's cookbook like it was a sacred scripture handed down from the heavens themselves. The Wexley Codex, as they reverently called it, had been passed through their bloodline for 120 years, containing recipes that supposedly defined their family's culinary legacy. Drusilla guarded this cookbook with an intensity that made security guards look casual. She kept it locked in a special glass case in her dining room, only removing it for family cooking sessions that felt more like religious ceremonies than casual gatherings. From my very first family dinner, I understood my place in the Wexley hierarchy. I was an outsider, a married-in, someone whose hands would never be worthy of touching their precious pages. The first family cooking night I attended happened 6 months after my wedding to Cassian. I'd been excited, hoping this would be my chance to bond with his family over our shared love of food. I arrived at Drusilla's sprawling home wearing my favorite apron, ready to contribute and learn. The moment I walked into her massive kitchen, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Drusilla looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain, her eyes lingering on my apron like it was an offensive piece of clothing. "Oh, you came prepared to cook," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How ambitious." The other family members, Cassian's aunts, uncles, and cousins, exchanged knowing glances that made my stomach sink. Drusilla gestured toward a small chair tucked in the corner of the kitchen, far from the central island where the actual cooking would happen. "You can watch quietly from there, dear. We have a very specific system, and it's best not to disrupt generations of tradition with inexperienced hands." When I instinctively reached toward the cookbook sitting on the counter, wanting just a glimpse of these legendary recipes, Drusilla literally blocked my hand with hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "Family bloodline only touches the codex," she said firmly. "Surely Cassian explained that to you." Over the following months, I learned more about the infamous Wexley Codex and the almost cult-like reverence the family held for it. The cookbook had originated with Cassian's great-great-grandmother, a woman named Esmeralda Wexley who'd emigrated from somewhere in Eastern Europe with recipes she claimed had been in her family for centuries before that. Each generation added their own recipes, annotations, and culinary wisdom, turning the book into a growing collection of family history written in flour, sugar, and spices. According to family law, anyone who cooked from the codex would create dishes so extraordinary that guests would weep with joy. Drusilla loved telling the story of how a famous food critic had once tasted her coq au vin and declared it transcendent. The rules around the codex were strict and non-negotiable. Only blood relatives could read it, touch it, or cook from it. Mariners like me were considered outsiders with tainted hands who would somehow corrupt the purity of these sacred recipes if we dared to even glance at them. "It's not personal," Cassian's Aunt Marguerite told me once, though her tone suggested it absolutely was personal. "It's about preserving family legacy. You understand." What none of them knew was that I didn't just like cooking. I loved it with a passion that probably exceeded theirs. I'd grown up in my grandmother's kitchen in a small coastal town, learning to cook before I could properly read. My grandmother had been a chef who'd traveled the world, collecting recipes and techniques from every country she visited. She taught me that food was a language of love, connection, and creativity. I'd spent my teenage years working in restaurant kitchens, my 20s traveling and learning from street vendors in Bangkok, pasta makers in Rome, and spice merchants in Mumbai. I kept journals filled with recipes, techniques, and food memories from dozens of countries. Cooking wasn't just a hobby for me. It was how I understood the world and expressed myself. I'd even started drafting a culinary memoir, documenting my food journey and the recipes that had shaped my life. But I kept all of this hidden from the Wexleys. Drusilla had made it clear from day one that she considered me culinarily inferior, someone who'd married above her station. Correcting that assumption felt pointless when she was so committed to believing it. So I stayed quiet, watched from corners, and swallowed my pride during family gatherings. The ultimate insult came during a formal family dinner celebrating Drusilla's 70th birthday. She'd invited extended family and several of her social circle friends, turning her dining room into a showcase for Wexley culinary superiority. The table practically groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes, each one supposedly prepared from precious codex recipes. I'd helped with prep work, chopping vegetables, washing dishes, setting the table, all the unglamorous tasks Drusilla deemed appropriate for someone of my status. During dinner, as guests praised each course with theatrical enthusiasm, Drusilla stood to make a speech. She thanked various family members for their contributions, naming specific relatives who'd helped prepare different dishes. Then she turned her gaze directly toward me, and I felt my stomach tighten with anticipation of whatever was coming. "You know," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "some people marry into gourmet families but will never truly understand real cuisine. They can learn to follow basic instructions, perhaps, but they'll never possess that innate culinary intuition that flows through true bloodlines." The entire table erupted in knowing laughter. Cassian squeezed my hand under the table, but he didn't defend me. He never did when his mother was on a roll. I smiled tightly and excused myself to the bathroom, where I stood staring at my reflection and wondering how much longer I could endure this humiliation. A month after that disastrous birthday dinner, I made the mistake of volunteering to cook a dish for the next family gathering. Drusilla had seemed almost amused by my offer, like watching a child attempt to juggle knives. "Well, if you insist," she'd said with a condescending smile, "you can make the appetizer. Something simple. Perhaps a cheese board." I'd ignored the insult and decided to prepare my grandmother's recipe for Mediterranean stuffed grape leaves, a dish I'd made hundreds of times with perfect results. I spent the entire morning carefully preparing the filling, rolling each grape leaf with practiced precision, and arranging them beautifully on a platter. I arrived at Drusilla's house early and placed them in her oven to warm. What I didn't know was that Drusilla had waited until I left the kitchen, then deliberately switched my olive oil with rancid cooking oil and added excessive salt to the filling. When the appetizers were served, they were inedible, bitter, overwhelmingly salty, and tasting of spoiled oil. The family's reactions ranged from disgusted grimaces to actual spitting into napkins. Drusilla looked at me with exaggerated sympathy. "Oh dear, Lyra. Cooking for a crowd is quite different from cooking at home, isn't it? Perhaps stick to simpler tasks next time." I knew immediately what she'd done, but proving it was impossible. Cassian looked embarrassed, and I felt my face burn with humiliation. That evening, I finally confronted Cassian about his mother's behavior. We stood in our kitchen, the tension thick between us as I recounted every insult, every dismissal, every deliberate humiliation I'd endured from his family. "She sabotaged my dish, Cassian. I know she did. Those grape leaves were perfect before I put them in her oven." Cassian ran his hands through his hair, looking genuinely torn. "I believe you, Lyra. I do. But my mother, she's set in her ways. The codex and family traditions are everything to her. It's not about you personally. It's absolutely about me personally," I said, my voice rising. "She treats me like I'm contaminated. Like my hands will somehow corrupt her precious recipes if I touch the same spoon she uses." Cassian tried to put his arms around me, but I stepped back. "I'll talk to her," he promised. "I'll make her understand she needs to respect you." But I knew he wouldn't. Or if he tried, Drusilla would deploy her specialty, emotional manipulation wrapped in maternal guilt. She'd cry about how her son didn't appreciate her sacrifices, how she devoted her life to preserving family legacy, how she was just trying to protect traditions his father would have wanted honored. And Cassian, despite being a grown man, would crumble under that guilt every single time. 2 weeks later, the situation reached its breaking point. Drusilla called to inform me that the family was hosting a major celebration. Cassian's cousin Elena was getting engaged, and there would be an elaborate dinner party. Then came the conditions. "You're welcome to attend, of course," Drusilla said, her tone making clear I wasn't actually welcome at all. "But I need to set some boundaries for this particular event. You cannot cook anything. You cannot touch the codex, naturally. And you cannot enter the main kitchen while we're preparing the feast. We have a very delicate menu planned, and we can't risk any complications." I stood in my living room, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something inside me finally snap. "So I can come to my husband's family celebration, but I'm banned from the kitchen entirely. I wouldn't phrase it as banned, dear. Think of it as protecting you from overwhelming yourself. You can help serve, perhaps, or arrange flowers. I'm sure you have other talents. The dismissiveness in her voice was the final straw. I'd tolerated 3 years of this treatment, swallowed countless insults, and watched from corners while they celebrated their supposed culinary superiority. But being formally banned from a kitchen at a family event felt like a line I couldn't uncross. The humiliation was complete, public, and apparently permanent. What Drusilla didn't know, what none of the Wexleys knew, was that I wasn't some unemployed housewife with no career or accomplishments. I deliberately kept my professional life separate from family gatherings because Drusilla had made so many assumptions about my background that correcting her felt exhausting. But the truth was simple. I was a publishing consultant specializing in culinary manuscripts. My company, Heritage Foodways Consulting, worked with chefs, food writers, and culinary historians to develop, edit, and prepare cookbooks for publication. I'd been doing this work for 8 years, building a reputation in the industry for my editorial precision and deep knowledge of food culture. I consulted for several major publishing houses, reviewed manuscript submissions, and connected authors with the right publishers for their projects. My work had helped launch 3 best-selling cookbooks and saved at least a dozen projects from editorial disasters. I made more money than Cassian did as a financial analyst, though I'd never mentioned that either. The Wexleys assumed I was unemployed or perhaps doing something insignificant with computers, as Drusilla had once dismissively suggested. I'd let them believe whatever they wanted, focused on my work and my marriage, telling myself their opinions didn't matter. But now, sitting with Drusilla's latest humiliation still burning, I felt differently about my silence. The following Monday, I was reviewing manuscript submissions in my home office when an email notification caught my attention. My assistant had forwarded a new project inquiry marked Priority Review Requested. I opened the attached files and felt my breath catch in my throat. The submission was titled The Wexley Codex, 8th edition, Full Print Authorization Request. My hands actually trembled as I scrolled through the documentation. Someone wanted to mass-produce the Wexley family cookbook, taking it from a private family heirloom to a commercially published book. The cover letter explained that this was a legendary family cookbook with generations of culinary wisdom that deserved to be shared with the world. The submission had been routed through one of the publishing houses I regularly consulted for, and they were asking for my professional opinion on its viability. I immediately checked the submission details, looking for the author's name. There it was, Drusilla Marie Wexley. My mother-in-law had submitted her precious, sacred, blood relatives-only cookbook for commercial publication. The same woman who'd banned me from even looking at it now wanted to print thousands of copies for complete strangers to buy. The hypocrisy was so staggering I almost laughed out loud. But more than that, I felt a cold realization settling in my chest. This manuscript had landed on my desk. I had professional authority over whether this project moved forward. I spent the next several hours carefully examining every detail of the submission. The handwriting in the scanned pages was definitely Drusilla's. I recognized her elaborate cursive from birthday cards she'd grudgingly sent me. The margin notes used phrases I'd heard her say countless times during family cooking sessions. This was absolutely, unmistakably her project. The proposal outlined her vision. A hardcover book featuring the Wexley family's most treasured recipes, complete with family photographs and stories about the legacy behind each dish. She'd even included testimonials from family members praising the codex's importance and the supposedly transformative power of these recipes. What struck me most was the tone of the proposal. Drusilla wrote about the cookbook with reverence, describing it as a sacred family treasure and culinary heritage that has been carefully guarded for over a century. Yet here she was, trying to commercialize it for profit while simultaneously banning actual family members, like me, from even touching it. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. I used my industry contacts to dig deeper into her plans. She'd already been in discussions with a specific printing company called Culinary Publishing, a mid-sized firm that specialized in heritage cookbooks and culinary memoirs. She'd apparently promised them this would be a bestseller. I called my contact at Culinary Publishing, a woman named Jennifer whom I'd worked with on several successful projects. Jen, I need to ask you about a submission you received. The Wexley Codex. Jennifer groaned audibly. Oh God, yes. The author has been calling us weekly for status updates. Very persistent woman. Very convinced her cookbook is going to be the next Julia Child phenomenon. What's the status of the project? We're interested, actually. The concept is solid. Heritage family cookbook with generational recipes. There's a market for that kind of nostalgic cooking. We were just waiting for editorial review before making an official offer. Why do you ask? I chose my words carefully. I might have some insider knowledge about this particular cookbook. Can you send me the full submission package? Jennifer agreed, and within an hour, my inbox contained everything. Drusella's proposal, sample recipes, her marketing plans, and most importantly, the contract she'd already negotiated with Culinary Crest. As I read through the documents, one detail made me sit up straighter in my chair. Culinary Crest Publishing wasn't an independent company. It was an imprint owned by a larger publishing conglomerate called Meridian Media Group. And Meridian Media Group was a company I knew extremely well. I owned it. 6 years ago, before I'd even met Cassian, I'd made a significant investment using money I'd inherited from my grandmother. She'd been a successful chef who'd saved and invested wisely, leaving me enough to take a real financial risk. I'd purchased a 72% controlling stake in a struggling publishing company that specialized in culinary books. With the help of smart business partners and my own industry knowledge, we'd turned that company around, expanded it into Meridian Media Group, and acquired several smaller imprints, including Culinary Crest Publishing. I'd kept my ownership quiet, operating through a holding company and letting professional managers handle day-to-day operations while I focused on editorial consulting. My name didn't appear on public-facing materials. Most people in the industry knew me as a consultant, not as an owner. It was a deliberate choice that had protected me from people who might treat me differently if they knew I had that kind of financial power. The Wexleys certainly had no idea. They knew I worked with books or did something in publishing but had never asked for details. Now I sat staring at my computer screen, processing the absurd irony. Drusella was trying to publish her precious cookbook through a company I legally owned and controlled. Every decision about this project would ultimately require my approval. I spent the next 2 days reading through the entire Wexley Codex manuscript that Drusella had submitted for publication. As the owner of the publishing company, I had full legal access to review any submission. I'd waited 3 years to see these supposedly legendary recipes, and now I was finally reading them under completely unexpected circumstances. My first reaction was shock. My second was disappointment. The recipes were mediocre. Not terrible, but absolutely not the transcendent culinary wisdom the family had built them up to be. The coq au vin that supposedly made a food critic weep was a basic French recipe you could find in any standard cookbook, with no special techniques or unique ingredients. The secret pasta sauce that family members raved about was essentially a conventional marinara with slightly more garlic than usual. Recipe after recipe revealed the same pattern. Traditional, conventional dishes with no particular innovation, complexity, or distinctive flair. Some were genuinely good home cooking recipes, the kind any competent home cook could master. But legendary? Worthy of 120 years of reverence? Absolutely not. I was stunned that the family had worshipped this cookbook like a holy text when it contained recipes that were frankly ordinary. The emperor had no clothes, and I was apparently the only one willing to see it. I called my lawyer, Marcus, who'd handled the legal aspects of my publishing business for years. I needed to understand my options and responsibilities before making any decisions about Drusella's project. So let me get this straight, Marcus said after I'd explained the situation. Your mother-in-law, who's been treating you terribly, has unknowingly submitted her family cookbook to a company you own, and now you're asking what you should do. Essentially, yes. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Well, legally, you have complete control here. You can reject the manuscript for any editorial reason. You can accept it and negotiate terms that favor you. You can require changes. As the majority owner, you don't owe her anything. But what's the ethical thing to do? I asked. That's not a legal question, Lyra. That's a personal one. But I'll say this, she submitted this manuscript through professional channels to a company she chose. She's seeking a business relationship with that company. You reviewing it as the owner isn't a conflict of interest. It's literally your job. The fact that you happen to know her personally doesn't change her decision to commercialize a family cookbook she previously claimed was too sacred for you to even touch. I sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Marcus was right. Drusilla had made this a business transaction the moment she submitted her manuscript for commercial publication. I wasn't ambushing her. She'd walked into my professional territory entirely of her own accord. 3 weeks later, Drusilla hosted an elaborate Sunday brunch at her home for the extended Wexley family. I knew something was coming because she'd been unusually cheerful when she'd called to invite me, her voice practically vibrating with suppressed excitement. Cassian and I arrived to find the house full of relatives, all dressed nicely and gathering in her formal living room. Drusilla stood at the front of the room, practically glowing with anticipation. Once everyone had settled with mimosas and pastries, she cleared her throat dramatically. Thank you all for coming today. I've gathered you here to share extraordinarily exciting news about our family legacy. She paused for effect, letting the anticipation build. As you all know, the Wexley Codex has been the heart of our family for 120 years. It represents everything we value: tradition, excellence, and culinary artistry. And now, I'm thrilled to announce that our beloved Codex is going to become a published cookbook available to the world. The room erupted in excited chatter. Relatives congratulated Drusilla, asking questions about publication timelines and whether they'd be mentioned in the book. She basked in the attention, explaining how she'd cultivated exclusive connections in the publishing industry and how major publishers were competing for the privilege of printing the Codex. I sat quietly in the back of the room, sipping my mimosa and watching this performance with growing amazement at her shameless bragging. What made the announcement particularly galling was that Drusilla had deliberately excluded me from any involvement in this cookbook project. While other family members were consulted about which recipes to include, asked to provide family stories, and invited to contribute photographs, I'd been kept completely in the dark. Several relatives glanced at me during the announcement, their expressions ranging from pity to smug satisfaction that I'd once again been reminded of my outsider status. Drusilla caught my eye at one point and gave me a smile that looked almost like a smirk, as if to say, "See? This is what real culinary legacy looks like. Something you'll never be part of." After the formal announcement, people mingled and discussed the cookbook project enthusiastically. Cassian's Aunt Marguerite actually approached me with faux sympathy. "It must be difficult, dear, watching the family celebrate something you can't be part of. But you understand why the cookbook needs to remain a blood family project, don't you?" I smiled tightly. I understand completely. What I actually understood was that Drusilla had made a massive miscalculation. She'd celebrated publicly, bragged about her publishing connections, and made very clear that this cookbook was moving forward. She'd backed herself into a corner where the entire family now expected this book to be published. And I held all the power to determine whether that would actually happen. 2 weeks after Drusilla's triumphant announcement, I sent the official response letter from Culinary Publishing. I'd worked with my editorial team to craft it carefully, using standard industry language for manuscript rejections. The letter was professional, polite, and absolutely devastating. It read, "Dear Ms. Wexley, thank you for submitting the Wexley Codex for our consideration. After thorough editorial review, we regret to inform you that we cannot move forward with publication of this manuscript. Our evaluation identified several concerns: structural culinary deficiencies in recipe development, lack of originality in core content, and insufficient distinctive voice to differentiate this work in a competitive cookbook market. Additionally, we've identified potential rights conflicts with previously published works that would require extensive legal review before publication could be considered. While we appreciate the personal significance this collection holds for your family, we do not believe it meets the commercial viability standards necessary for publication through our imprint. We wish you the best in your future endeavors and encourage you to consider whether this collection might be better suited to private family preservation rather than commercial publication. Sincerely, the editorial board, Culinary Publishing." I had the letter sent via certified mail, requiring signature confirmation. 3 days later, I received notification that Drusilla had signed for it. Then I waited for the explosion I knew was coming. The explosion came faster than even I anticipated. The next morning, I received a frantic call from Jennifer at Culinary Crest's main office. "Lyra, we have a situation. A woman just stormed into our reception area demanding to speak with whoever rejected her cookbook. She's calling our editorial board incompetent imbeciles and threatening legal action. Security is involved. It's intense." I felt a calm settle over me. "What's the woman's name?" "Drusilla Wexley. She's demanding to speak with the CEO immediately. She won't leave until someone explains how we could possibly reject what she's calling a legendary culinary masterpiece." I checked the time. "I can be there in 40 minutes. Have security escort her to the executive conference room and offer her water. Do not engage with her arguments. Just tell her the CEO will address her concerns personally." Jennifer sounded relieved. "Thank you. She's making quite a scene." I dressed carefully in my most professional outfit, a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority without being flashy. I pulled my hair back, put on minimal makeup, and gathered the files I would need. Then I drove to Culinary Crest's downtown headquarters, a building I'd purchased 3 years ago but had rarely visited in person. When I arrived, security briefed me on Drusilla's behavior. She'd been ranting about incompetence and demanding to know what kind of culinary Philistines ran this company. She was exactly as insufferable as I'd expected. I took a deep breath, straightened my jacket, and walked into the executive conference room. Drusilla was pacing angrily, muttering to herself. She turned as the door opened, her face flushed with rage. "Finally, are you the CEO? Do you have any idea what kind of mistake your company has made?" I walked calmly to the head of the long conference table and set down my leather portfolio. "Please, have a seat, Ms. Wexley. We should discuss this professionally." She remained standing, too agitated to sit. "I don't need to sit. I need you to explain how your so-called editorial board could possibly reject a cookbook that's been treasured by my family for over a century. Do you have any idea what you're turning down?" I sat down calmly, opened my portfolio, and pulled out my business card. I slid it across the polished table toward her. "I'm quite familiar with what we're turning down." Drusilla snatched up the card and read it. I watched as her eyes moved across the text. "Lyra Wexley, Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Media Group." Her face went completely white. The card slipped from her fingers and fluttered back to the table. She stared at me like she was seeing a ghost. You own this company." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I own the parent company. Culinary Crest is one of our imprints. Has been for 6 years." I let the silence hang heavy in the room while Drusilla processed this revelation. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Finally, I spoke calmly and professionally. "Let me lay out the facts, Ms. Wexley. You submitted a manuscript for commercial publication through standard industry channels. That manuscript was reviewed by professional editors according to our normal evaluation criteria. The rejection you received was based on legitimate editorial concerns." I pulled out a printed copy of her submission. "First, you tried to commercialize a cookbook you've spent years calling sacred and claiming was too precious for certain family members to even touch. That's your choice, but it does raise questions about authenticity. Second, our editorial team found that many of your recipes lack originality. Several are nearly identical to recipes published in other cookbooks, which creates potential copyright concerns. Third, the writing lacks the distinctive voice necessary to stand out in an extremely competitive cookbook market." I paused, letting each point sink in. "Fourth, and most importantly, you submitted this manuscript to my company while simultaneously excluding me, your daughter-in-law who actually works in publishing, from any involvement in the project. You banned me from your kitchen, insulted my cooking abilities, and made very clear I wasn't worthy of your family's culinary legacy. Then you tried to profit from that same legacy without my knowledge." Drusilla's face cycled through emotions: shock, embarrassment, anger, and finally something resembling panic. Drusilla sank into the chair across from me, her earlier rage completely deflated. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted to that manipulative tone she used so effectively on Cassian. "Lyra, I had no idea. If I'd known this was your company, I obviously would have approached things differently. Fake tears welled in her eyes. You have to understand, the codex is so important to our family. I was just trying to preserve our legacy. I never meant to hurt you. I remained unmoved. You've hurt me repeatedly for 3 years, Drusilla. You've insulted my cooking, banned me from family kitchens, sabotaged my dishes, and made very clear that I'm not good enough for your family. This isn't about ignorance, it's about consistent disrespect. She tried again. But publishing this cookbook, rejecting it publicly, you're breaking our family apart. Is that what you want? To destroy Cashin's relationship with his mother? I'm not destroying anything. You chose to commercialize a family cookbook and submit it for professional review. That submission landed with a company I own, which you didn't research before approaching. The editorial rejection was legitimate. Your recipes genuinely aren't original enough for commercial publication. That's not revenge. That's business. Drusilla's expression hardened slightly as she realized emotional manipulation wasn't working. So what happens now? You're going to humiliate me in front of my entire family. I leaned back in my chair and considered my options. Part of me wanted to reject her manuscript entirely and let her deal with the consequences of her public announcement. But another part of me, the part that still loved Cassian and wanted some kind of functional family relationship, knew that complete humiliation would make things worse for everyone. I'm going to offer you a choice, Drusilla. 2 options, and you need to decide which one you prefer. She looked wary but nodded. Option 1. You withdraw the manuscript entirely, tell your family that you decided the cookbook is too precious to commercialize, and we all move forward without this becoming a bigger issue. You preserve your dignity, I preserve my professional standards, and the codex remains a private family collection. I paused. Option 2. We publish the cookbook through Culinary Crest, but with significant conditions. The manuscript requires substantial editorial work, including proper attribution for recipes that appear in other published works. The book will include a comprehensive acknowledgement section crediting all contributors, including me as the project's editor-in-chief. You'll split royalties with me 50-50, and the book cover will list both of us as authors. The Wexley Codex by Drusilla Wexley, edited and expanded by Lyra Wexley. You get your published cookbook, but you publicly acknowledge my role and expertise. Drusilla looked like she might choke. Her face turned red, and I could see her struggling with the impossible choice I'd given her. Drusilla sat in furious silence for a long moment before standing abruptly. I need to think about this. I need to talk to my family. Take the time you need, I said calmly, but understand that this offer expires in 2 weeks. After that, the manuscript is permanently rejected, and you'll need to find another publisher, which will be difficult after a rejection from a reputable company. She left without another word, and I sat alone in the conference room feeling oddly calm. A week later, Cassian called a family meeting at our house. He'd been caught in the middle of this entire situation, and I'd finally told him everything. My ownership of the publishing company, Drusilla's submission, and the choice I'd offered her. To his credit, he'd been more supportive than I'd expected. The family gathered in our living room, tension thick in the air. Drusilla sat rigid and silent while Cassian explained what had actually happened. He told them about the manuscript submission, the rejection, and, most importantly, about Drusilla's attempt to publish a sacred family cookbook while excluding me from any involvement despite my professional expertise in publishing. Watching the family process this information was fascinating. Several relatives looked genuinely shocked. Others seemed embarrassed. Cashin's Aunt Marguerite actually apologized to me, admitting she'd been unfairly judgmental. In the end, Drusilla chose option 1. She withdrew the manuscript and told the family she decided the codex was too precious to commercialize. It wasn't the dramatic public vindication I might have fantasized about, but it was enough. The power dynamic in the family shifted noticeably after that meeting. People asked about my work with genuine interest instead of dismissive politeness. I was invited into the kitchen at family gatherings and actually encouraged to cook. Drusilla remained cool toward me but never openly hostile again. She seemed to understand that I held cards she couldn't afford for me to play. 6 months later, I released my own cookbook through a different imprint I owned, Flavors of Freedom, recipes I was told I couldn't cook. It combined recipes from my grandmother's kitchen with dishes I'd learned traveling the world, woven together with stories about food, family, and finding your own voice. The book became a bestseller within 3 months, receiving praise for its authentic voice and genuinely innovative recipes. The Wexley family bought copies. Some even told me they preferred it to the Codex. Drusilla retreated into quiet humiliation, her culinary superiority permanently deflated. And I finally stepped fully into my own power, no longer hiding my expertise or apologizing for my presence in a family that had tried so hard to diminish me. The Codex still sits in Drusilla's glass case, but it no longer holds any power over me. I'd built something better entirely on my own terms.